Welcome to Physio Monday, everyone. Today we are talking about wrist injuries. This is something that's quite common for a lot of people, especially if you start on your calisthenics journeys. And it's no surprise because the wrist is the smallest and weakest joint in your upper body if you're going to put all your weight on it. Stick around.
What's up, tribe? My name's Yanni Burmeister. Across the table is Rad. Behind the mixer is Richie. And to my left is Phil White, aka Switched On Physio. Name could potentially change soon. We are Unity Gym and the Unified Movement System. Today we're going deep into wrist injuries because we've all had them. Question of the day before we get started. Let us know if you've ever had a wrist injury and how did you fix it if you did. Would love to get your feedback and comments and a bit of discussion happening in the comments. How's everyone today?
Good?
Yeah, been thinking about changing my name to Greg for a while, and I think it's time.
No, in all fairness, Phil's in work behind the scenes on a very exciting project, working in collaboration with another amazing physiotherapist, and they potentially are going to launch.
Yeah. Basically, I started up Switched On Physio when I was doing my online physiotherapy, and it was kind of a space that, the name originally came for my idea for a podcast that I'm doing where I interview physios and try and help mentor myself and then help others in the process. And so that was the idea for Switched On Physio. And then now I've got this exciting collaboration that I'm working on, and things should be starting to roll out soon, and that will be under a different name. So.
Yeah. Morning, Jose, and anyone else that's on the live stream, give us a little shout out so we can say good morning to you as well.
And morning to Richard. For those of you not who aren't aware, who aren't in the know, Richard is now mic'd up. So Richie, how are you today?
I'm doing good. Had a nice weekend, relaxing weekend. Not much to share, didn't do too much. Enjoyed some good food, caught up on some sleep. That's it.
Sounds good.
You've got no idea how badly I feel like I'm holding back the jokes about overcoming wrist injuries, but I'm going to keep it clean today. So, but this is like, for me, this is it's a hard
family friendly.
This is a really hard thing for me. If anybody knows me, I feel like I'm kind of sitting here ready to explode. But yep.
Let's keep it family friendly today. Let's keep it family friendly. Well, it's good to have Richie on the mic.
So should we read out the question that has spawned this show? Should we?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is coming from a question by Calle Alexander. I'm not sure if that's pronunciation is right, or if that's Spanish. Maybe it's Calle Alexander. On the Movement Mastermind group. And it says, "Hey guys, new to the group. Been loving the YouTube videos and podcast. I have a question about wrist mobility/flexibility. About 2 years ago, I broke my scaphoid bone in my wrist. I got a screw in there now. Since the surgery, the pain has gotten a lot better, but there's still pain and I can't do a proper push-up or handstand because my wrist doesn't bend that far anymore. Does anyone have any advice on how I can possibly recover from this? Would love to be able to do a handstand.
So
someday, thanks."
So there's a screw still in the wrist.
Yep.
Inside the wrist.
Yep.
So that's obviously going to create a permanent disability. Is that right?
Not necessarily disability and not necessarily permanent. And I think. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, before we get the logical mind on it, can I share a story? Because
I just think this is such a this is about this guy with the wrist with a screw in it, but there's going to be so much about how to. The basic principles, and then everyone will be really useful, especially if you're doing that handstand master class at the moment.
So Kalisha, when she first started here, that's for those of you who don't know, that's my fiance, and she used to work for Unity Gym. That's how we met many moons ago. She had exactly the same break, the scaphoid bone in the wrist. It was from a snowboarding accident, and
I've also had it. It's really common if you fall with your arm outstretched.
That's right, yeah. And initially, when she first came here, she couldn't load the wrist at all, and she had no chance of doing a handstand. And it was actually quite literally, since she did our wrist routine daily for a long time, and she's still got a a screw in there and stuff like that. It was never removed. She can now do handstands and stuff like that. So there's still this. I don't know whether it's the psychology or whether there's limitation there. She still does talk about her wrist, and she's aware of it and she's cautious of it. But it's certainly opened up and improved after doing a bit of active mobility, mobbing, joint mobbing, and strengthening.
And just for the people listening in, when Yanni says mobbing, you mean movement, right? Not because in physio land, that's...
I would refer to the loaded flexibility stuff we do on the wrist. I would refer to as mobbing, because we are moving the bones around a little bit, doing those twists and things like that. You know, I mean it in the literal form there. Yeah.
Yep. Have you had any wrist injuries, Radden?
Sure have. Yeah, excuse me. So, I mean, when I did martial arts, I had several wrist injuries, but that was, a long time ago, and my wrist did get stronger over time, but, like punching the wrong way, and man, like wrist injuries in martial arts are full on, because it often comes from, hitting something with full force, and then your wrist goes boom and buckles under it. So it's a really traumatic experience. But in more recent times, and something that maybe people that are doing the UMS can relate to a little bit better, when I started learning how to do handstands, I just went into it without conditioning my wrist properly. And so, and what I mean by that is I did too much volume. So understanding the process now, I did too much volume on my hands without having conditioned my wrist effectively. And I got to a point where I couldn't invert, I couldn't put weight on my hands without being in really bad pain. And I went and saw Leroy. That was when you were still studying, and I couldn't get in touch with you. And I went out to Leroy, and he worked some magic on me, and basically said, look, you're going to have to stop doing handstands until you strengthen your wrists enough. And then I went through the whole process of strengthening my wrists, and it took about 6 months before I could invert again. Yep. And ever since then, I've never had a problem.
Yeah, perfect. So the wrist is such an interesting joint because they're quite different to the other joints in your body, and especially when it comes to this kind of crowd where we're doing gymnastics, it really takes some planning and preparation to get to the point where you can start loading weight bearing through a joint that is not maybe evolved to be entirely a weight bearing joint. And so why it's an interesting joint is that sorry, I'm so distracted by...
I'm looking for this photograph. I'm looking for this photograph of me doing a handstand on my wrists that we could potentially bring up to show how much you can strengthen the wrists, but it's all right. I won't.
Yeah. Okay, so with the hand and the wrist, you basically have a whole bunch of little bones in your hand, and one of them is your carpal bones, and the scaphoid is one of them. And then as it crosses the wrist joint, it's as if you feel around your wrist, you'll notice that it's quite different to your knee, where you run into your quads, your hamstrings, and your calves. Most of the muscles that support your wrist are actually what you call extrinsic muscles. So they're not in and around, the muscle bellies aren't around the wrist. A lot of the muscles that control your hand and your wrist are actually coming from further up your forearm. So you can imagine if you start trying to load up through that joint and weight bear through that joint, the muscles kind of aren't going to be as strong and aren't going to be as directly stabilizing through the joint. So it's much more common to develop sort of joint passive structure injuries. So that's bone, cartilage. So your TFCC is a really common one in the wrist, and because there is just generally not as much muscle around there kind of supporting. So it takes it. So you can imagine that if you get into wrist stuff really quickly, your passive structures we know take a bit longer to develop. So it's kind of a common thing where people are like, I've done a couple of weeks of wrist prep, I should just be able to bang out some handstands. But really, because you're really loading up these passive structures in a big way, it just takes that much longer to develop it. So it's a
and
really
do you want to just remind our audience, Phil, on how long it takes for those passive structures to start going through to start adapting to load and becoming stronger and more robust?
Yeah, so if we think about muscles first, so active structures generally take around that sort of 6 week thing to really start to see some proper hypertrophy and muscle size change. And so when you're thinking about passive structures, it can be much longer, basically.
What are we looking at? Six months to 24 months kind of thing?
For ligaments, sort of 3 month mark, and then cartilage, sort of a bit longer than that, and bones remodel, quite slowly again as well. So
and that's the minimum time. That's when
that's not to say that you can't do anything, because obviously the way we help make these structures remodel is by giving them a stress that then they respond to. So not to say don't do anything for 6 weeks, because if you don't do anything, you're not going to get stronger. So
let's just quickly outline what it looks like in our wrist prep conditioning. Taking for example the handstand masterclass, because that's the most obvious example. The way we do it is we condition the wrists in a kneeling position where you're completely in control of how much load you put through your wrist. Then we slowly bring the feet So the knees are quite close to the hand position in that instance. And then the way we progressively overload it is we slowly, progressively pull the knees away from the hands, and eventually we go up onto our toes. So you're in a push-up position doing your wrist prep work. And then from there, we start to invert and go onto your hands. And the whole process happens very progressively using the key two sort of strength and conditioning principles: progressive overload and, of course, load management, good load management. And this is the difficult thing when people say, oh, I want to learn handstands. The first thing they do is they try and invert.
Yeah.
And inversion is 100% of the body weight going through the wrists.
And and if especially when you're starting handstands, you're not very controlled as well. So you're now trying to deal with like a total end range. So when you're doing a 4-point kneeling and then out to push-up position, you're in extension. But when you get to inversion and handstands, you're even going like kind of forcing past it there, and you're not doing it in a very controlled way when you're first learning to handstand.
So I just want to build some context. I really want this to sink in for the people watching, for the viewers watching. Doing a handstand without doing proper wrist prep and wrist conditioning, which, as we've just heard, can take months and months to adapt the passive structures, is no different, in my opinion, to trying to do a bodyweight barbell back squat without conditioning your body to do so. It's like if you're an 80 kilo or 90 kilo guy, put 80 or 90 kilos on without doing any prior preparation work and then try and back squat. The notion is ridiculous. Yeah. And that's why we say, if you want to learn to do something like a handstand, you have to put in the foundational work.
I'd argue it's more like putting 180 on your
I
back,
would say as well. Yeah, it's
because
so
when you think about the wrists and what they're sort of we generally use them for more like fine motor things. So they're not kind of the structures aren't like your ankle where they're all sort of like congruent weight bearing joints that are meant to be kind of passively loaded. This is fine motor, not weight bearing.
Well,
so this is
So we are not designed to do handstands. Like genetically, when you look at our bodies and you look at the way we are, we certainly weren't built in a way that we were meant to put all of our weight on our hands. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. But you've got to understand the process that it takes, and you just need to look at the foot and the ankle and the whole leg structure. That just the lower limb is so much more robust than the arms and the wrists, and you're going down to that finest
and the
point.
Shoulders, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Look at the hip to the shoulder joint.
Yeah.
That's the big one.
Yeah.
Like that's the dead giveaway.
Yeah.
The shoulder joint is designed for mobility. The hip joint is designed for stability.
And power generation.
And so let me give a new example, because this is very recent. And we won't just talk about handstands here. How else does this apply? Well, lately I have a history of boxing. I've boxed to some form since I was 14 years old, right up until the age of 30 years old. And then I sort of stopped boxing for business reasons. I just didn't want to do. I'm very competitive, and I found it hard not to be competitive when I was boxing. And recently, as my weight goes up, as I get older, I thought, okay, I'm going to start doing a day a week of boxing again. And I've still got a punching bag here and a speed ball, and I've put on a lot of weight in the meantime. I stood on the scales with Phil last week, I think at 95.5 kilos, and. So, I'm carrying more weight. There's definitely more power and more weight behind my punches. And I went up and started sort of hitting the punching bag, and my wrists and my hands aren't conditioned to the level that they used to be. I used to be able to punch a concrete wall and get away with it with a little bit of bruising, and I completely stuffed both my wrists. And I was in my mind, I was like, okay, only do 70%. Only hit this heavy bag at 70% of your speed and power. And even that was enough to buckle. And there wasn't a point where
that's a really good example of like your conditioning needs to be specific for your activity. So although you've been doing lots of wrist prep for, kind of weight bearing and controlled stuff, you haven't had the prep for like ballistic kind of resisted extension, which is basically what punching is. And that's is just a really good example of if you want to be working ballistically, you need to start off being not ballistic and then gradually increase the speed and intensity and all of that. But then for so it's very much, you got to think about your goals, have your goals in mind, as we always sort of say, and think about the stepping stones to get there. So that's so key when if we kind of walk through our wrist prep here, what that's kind of designed for a handstand, which is going to be really useful for other wrist boxing, but it's not going to be the same as like slowly building up your your tolerance, hitting a bag. So
That's right.
Yeah.
cool. Okay, so when it comes to the scaphoid injury, this is a really common one, and it's very relevant for anyone who's kind of having trouble getting into handstands, because basically it's when often it's that loaded extension position, so weight bearing into extension. And so what we think about with all joints is the first up, like how much range of motion you have. And so Kelly was saying that he's finding it really hard to get into full extension. And so when you think about range of motion in the wrist, it's a kind of a funny one to test, because usually with a joint, or you'd go one way and then you'd go the other and test your flexion and extension. But when you think about that in the wrist, if I'm doing it with a straight hand, if I go down into flexion with a straight hand, that's the end range of the joint for my for flexion. But if I go back like this, now it's going to be the muscle stretch. So if I'm keeping my hand straight, it's something that people often kind of get a bit wrong when testing. Is if you're going full extension with your hand open, then it's actually going to be your forearm flexors that are the limiting factor, and you can kind of tell the difference there by feeling that kind of hard endpoint versus like a bit of a bouncy, stretchy endpoint. And so if you're looking at if you can get into full extension with your wrist open, that's probably going to be a forearm flexor tightness if you can't quite get there. Whereas if you go into a closed fist, now if you go into full flexion, so wrist going towards the forearm, now you can really feel it pull on your extensors. So now that's your kind of extensor length. But if you go into extension, now that's your true sort of joint end range. So that's a really kind of key one to understand the passive versus active resistance of the muscles. So why that's important is when you're figuring out like, okay, can I not get into extension? Is it because I've got tight muscles, or is it an actual joint thing? So if you're not able to get in a extended position while you've got your full fist, but then you open your fingers and it's about the same, then that still means it's a passive structure issue, which I'm sure is what Callie is having here.
So let's just slow down for a sec. For those of you listening on the podcast, let's just explain exactly what Phil demonstrated, because you can't see the video. And I urge you, if you do want to see the video, it's going to be up on YouTube at Unity Gym, or get over to the UMS Movement Mastermind private Facebook group, and you can interact with us whilst we're doing this recording. But what he did there was he demonstrated with a closed fist, make a fist, and then test the wrist mobility, and that will indicate whether it's a
so in flexion, if you're in a fist, if you go into flexion, it's going to be your extensors, so the dorsal side of your hand, the back side of your hand, that's the muscle tightness there. But if you go into extension, fist into extension is the joint end of range. Whereas if you go into a open hand, going into flexion is going to be the joint end of range flexion. I know this is really hard to conceptualize, but then going into extension is now going to be the forearm flexor muscle length. So it's one that kind of, if you just try that yourself, go forward and back, you can feel the muscles pulling when you go into fist into flexion and open hand into extension. And so that's the kind of one of the key things to understand is whether or not it's like a joint block or if it's a kind of muscular block, because that will tell you, if all the flexibility principles apply for muscles, or if you maybe have a joint thing going on.
And just quickly, because I've spoken to people who are very, very convinced, people that I trust, their feedback, are very convinced that even if it is a joint block, you over time, if you're progressive, you can increase the mobility still. It's not going to increase by a huge amount.
So it's definitely going to be somewhat case by case. So for someone like Kelly with a screw in there, like obviously that can, when you have sort of external things that it's really hard for me to say whether or not he'll ever be able to get that back. And probably talking to the surgeon in conjunction with a hand physio is the best way to go with that if you have like a special circumstance like a surgical thing. But with like any sort of rehab principles, gradual exposure is going to be the way to achieve it. And it's often like, if you push it too much and aggravate it, then you go a bit backwards. So you just got to find that sort of sweet spot to keep moving forward.
One thing I will say, I know that this kind of contradicts what Phil said there, but my experience with surgeons and doctors is that they will tell you worst case scenario to prepare you. They don't want to tell you, give you false hope. And but I actually disagree with the notion of that, because I feel like it really restricts your, it stifles your like your motivation, and it sort of prevents people from even trying because they kind of get told by a surgeon or a specialist or a doctor, no, you won't get that mobility back. There's no, and then that implies there's no point trying, which I really heavily disagree with, because I've seen some remarkable changes in people when they do sort of deploy a mentality of I'm going to achieve this at all costs.
His foot injury back in the day, he
I had the same with my back. I've had the same with my shoulder. I've had the same with my knee. You know, I was told that I would never squat heavy again after my knee reconstruction. If those of you who follow me on Facebook, you would have seen me do a beautiful pause rep at 170 kilos last week. You know, I was told that I'd never deadlift as heavy as I'm deadlifting.
Keen to say, like, work with surgeons, because they're the ones who've done the thing, they've done the scans, everything. But work in conjunction with a hand physio is a good idea, and it's bonus points if you can work with someone who is also working with elite athletes in that space, so gymnasts or boxers, especially something depending on your particular sport.
I think that's a big one. Working with a physio, and this is something that I think, because it's Physio Monday, we should certainly frame. There's a very big difference between working with a general pops physio who specialises in just getting people to a baseline and someone like Phil. I've experienced this firsthand myself. When I came out of rehab for my knee, I was basically rehabbed like a general pops. General population, just to be able to take a flight of stairs and sit in and out of a chair. And the moment I started getting back into my serious weightlifting, my knee really flared up. I got what's referred to as a Baker's cyst, which is a fluid build up in the back of the knee, and it became quite uncomfortable. And then I went to see a friend of mine who Phil's also worked with, who's a physio to more elite athletes, and he had a completely different approach and gave me a completely different plan of attack. And a year later, I'm back to where I was before. And he sort of said, look, you got to understand, these people that you worked with in the hospital, they're not trying to get you to elite level. They're just trying to get you to be able to leave the hospital and walk around, and they want to tick the basic boxes. Yep. That's exactly right. So there's a difference, and you need to make sure that the physio that you align yourself with is a performance. They got performance in mind, because most of the people watching this aren't settling for basic general pop standards. You know, they're wanting to take their bodies a little bit further. And if you need to connect with Phil, you can do online. You can connect with him online, and he can at least give you some guidance. You know,
as you're not in America.
Yeah. Well, even still, you can ask questions, and he can give you general feedback. He can't, unfortunately, because of legal reasons and insurance purposes, he can't consult with someone in America, but you can still give them feedback. You know.
Yeah.
So should we? But we're running out of time. Should we answer some of these questions? Here before we finish?
I just really want to just get back to Callie's question and kind of wrap that up. One thing that is really quite challenging when you can't get into that full range. Obviously, handstands are pretty much out, but what you can do is use stall bars.
That's what I was about to say.
And basically anything where you're in a neutral grip position. So if you have stall bars,
jump online. Not even stall bars, parallettes. Jump online, brother, and Amazon. On Amazon, you can get a nice little set of the wooden parallettes. They're like little mini parallettes.
They only sit about a couple of inches off the ground.
Yeah, that's right. And this is exactly what they're designed for. And I have heaps of friends who still master handstands and hand balancing using those.
Yeah, and bonus, it's going to be great for a joint injury, because when looking at, and part of why we test with the to see if it's an active or passive structure, the testing is meant to inform your treatment and your guidance. So if your joint is not quite getting there because of a passive sort of block, then think we need to bring more stability to help facilitate that movement. So by doing parallel and working on your hand balancing, what you're doing is getting awesome co-contraction of the muscles around your wrists, so not only flexors and extensors, but also the lateral and ulnar and radial deviators as well, which all work as a that active sort of scaffolding around your wrist. So the more you can be working towards your goals, doing the hand balancing, but also in a sort of relevant functional way, you're going to get great strength. You're going to get good load tolerance, which is so much of this is overcoming sort of the perceived threat pain stuff that we've talked a lot about in previous episodes.
Yep.
And by being more comfortable in that position in a slightly less aggressive range, that's an awesome way of doing it. So
yeah, there you go. So not only is it going to be beneficial for your handstands, it's also going to be a great idea for your wrist, brother, and it might help unlock that wrist in future. There you go.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, look, my general experience and what I recommend for everyone is that if you're going to go down the road of learning how to do any kind of calisthenics training, anything that involves putting weight on your hands, you're going to need to spend 6 months conditioning your wrists. And that's what I did when I developed my wrist pain. I basically said to myself, all right, for the next 6 months, I'm going to work on conditioning my wrist. And what that looked like for me was I started with 2 days a week. And then when that wasn't causing me pain, I went to 3 days a week. And I just followed the general wrist conditioning that we do in the Handstand Masterclass. And I also had done the stuff that we do in the UMS Foundations program, which is different.
And it's also in the 18-minute stretch routine. Isn't it?
Yeah, differently. I mean, the exercises are, but the devil's in the dosage, and it's about the way that it's explained in the Handstand Masterclass and the way that you explain the dosage.
So the other really important sort of takeaway rehab point is often with these things, as we talked about before, with capacity and load, and think about your bucket and how much water you're putting in that bucket. Often you sort of, with wrists, it sort of has a certain amount and you can handle, and then it just becomes too much. So if you can think about how you're using your wrists throughout the rest of your training and also the rest of your day, then that can really help. By you might have it in you to do a couple of handstands a week, but if you are also doing some heavy bench press when you're in a really extended position, if you're also doing push-ups in a regular sort of hand position, if you're practicing your planche, if you're doing all of that plus you're trying to do handstands, that can sometimes be too much.
Yep.
Whereas if you adapt your exercises, so maybe doing, instead of barbell bench press in an extended position, going into a dumbbell in a neutral position, so now your wrists are in neutral. If you're doing push-ups but you do it in your fists instead, trying to think about how you can load up a neutral position, and then in your outside of work, in your life, if you're at a keyboard and your wrists are really extended for the whole day and you just kind of jamming that extension all day as well, think about getting a wrist support so you then go into that supported neutral position, and that way now you've suddenly just taken out about 90% of the time you're usually at extension, so you might be able to get a few good sort of handstand sessions in a week because you've deloaded in other areas. So that's just a really important way. Just think about when you're doing your and with ring pull-ups, maybe just taking a bit of time off the false grip, just trying to think about how you're using your wrist in other activities, and adapting it generally to neutral will be a nice way to do it.
Awesome.
All right, team. So let's move into some of these questions here. So I'll just
Comments.
see which... Chris Grant saying, fell in winter and jammed my wrist to where it was hard to move for several weeks, let alone pushing. Overcome by doing range of motion wrist exercises and by doing a distraction of metacarpals, which helped stretching forearm some. I still occasionally have issues, but the wrist mobility warm-up I learned from Rad helps tremendously. That's awesome.
Nice. And just on with kind of people often wear wrist supports, and that can be another way of just kind of taking a bit of an edge off that kind of jamming extension.
That's what I've been doing at the moment with my lifting. I've just gone back to using straps so that I could still, and it's not comfortable doing bench press. Even doing squats has been fairly uncomfortable, but with wrist straps it just takes that edge off it so that it's sort of a bit better. It also gives me peace of mind. It makes it feel a bit better.
So Tony Rotella saying, man, this is timely. Just fell off an electric skateboard 10 weeks ago. Still can't do a push-up. Range of motion is fine. Just painful to support weight on it. Can do a push-up on my fists fine, and no pain when poked or prodded. My PT thinks it's a trapped nerve. I have an appointment with an orthopedist tomorrow. Great. Let's see how that appointment goes.
Glad you're following that up. Good to see that. One thing with obviously painful on weight bearing is often really common, and it can be really frustrating because it kind of can stick around for a long time, and you can feel like, oh man, anytime I try and progress I keep on getting pain. So this is a really helpful time to try and get some objective measures about whether or not you are progressing, because often people get really frustrated. They're in pain at the start of a rehab journey, and then 6 weeks later they're still in pain, but they don't realize it now. They've actually progressed with how much weight they're putting on, how much time they're doing. So using kind of old school analog scales can be a really nice way of testing your weight bearing. So even just having it on maybe use a physio table in front, but you could do it, I guess, in 4-point kneeling, trying to put weight into your hand and trying to have a certain pain threshold cut off, so maybe 5 out of 10, or even just onset of pain, and see how much weight you can put onto that wrist, and then that way when you've done a bunch of training a couple of weeks later, come back and see if you've progressed, because often you still will be in pain, but now you're putting 40% more weight through that wrist, and that's progress. people often think like, oh, I'm still in pain, so I haven't progressed. But no, like that's
Yeah,
really
for
important
sure.
progress. So
Yeah.
it's just a key one to think about, and getting objective measures. The two you usually use are grip strength. So using a dynamometer is great if you can, but obviously most people don't have that. But like a grip testing with like even pinch testing of plates in the gym can be a good way of doing it. But otherwise, yeah, the weight bearing onto a scale.
Yep. Erica's saying, I injured my wrist by trying to do too much too soon, training muscle ups with a false grip. I remember not even being able to turn a key without wincing in pain. I went to see Leroy, who told me that I needed to strengthen my forearm muscles. So I've been doing forearm strengthening exercises since then. It's healed now, but it took a long time, like 5 months or so. I remember that, Erica. Erica is one of our superstar members at the gym. You might have seen her videos on our Instagram page doing planches and pull-ups. She's an absolute
Flag
weapon.
the other day.
Flag the other day, yeah, that was Erica. And yeah, I remember that time for you, Erica. And it seems so long ago now, so it's so good to see that you did the work and got the results and healed your body.
You skipped Janelle.
Yeah, Janelle is. Oh, did I? Sorry, Janelle's saying, so glad I saw this pop up. I have been doing the forearm exercises, but my right wrist feels all crunchy. I just push through it, and when I warm up, it works. But man, I cannot bear weight on it cold. So that's quite a common thing, isn't it, Phil? Like
Yeah.
the way that things like warm up and then you feel okay, but you need to watch out for that, don't you?
Yeah. And like often with kind of warm up, like pain, like initial pain, it's often that kind of tendinopathy process we kind of think about, where that's a common one where like if you start off and it's in pain and then it feels better once you get going, often that can be more on the tendinopathy side of things, where if it's an acute injury, as soon as you put your weight in it, it's going to be nasty, and the more you do it, it gets worse. And so yeah, both of these ladies have been talking about how that doing forearm exercise, and that's just a really key one that I hope people have taken away, that it's your forearm muscles that control your wrist. So if you get nice big strong forearms, then your wrist will be so much more supported. And obviously doing flexion extension exercises are great, but often if you think about how your wrist works, it's often working isometrically, so actually bracing against a force, and your elbows moving or your shoulders are moving. So really you got to think that doing concentric knee extension could be great, but if you're pushing into a painful range, that's can be somewhat detrimental. So really try and think about how you can build in that kind of co-contraction stuff as well, which is weight bearing.
Just before we go forward, I just want to confirm whether Janelle's doing the foundations forearm exercises where you're really strengthening supination, pronation, flexion extension, ulnar and radial deviation, or just the warm-up routine.
Well, she's just joined the UMS program, so I hope you are doing that stuff, Janelle, because
I would recommend really sinking your teeth into the foundations program.
Janelle is the person that we spoke to about last week, where she doesn't have access to a full gym, and I think she just has gymnastics rings at home.
Okay.
So maybe
Broomstick.
So yeah, the broomstick. Yeah, in the very least, like with a broom, you can do the pronation and supination and the radial and ulnar deviation. Yeah, with the broom. If you have a look at the phase 2 and 3 of the foundations program in the bent arm strength workouts, you should see those exercises. I'd be doing those for sure.
Yeah, and I would make it a priority if you are only ever going to work at home to invest a few $100 into a set of 1 to 10 kilo dumbbells. Just the Hex dumbbells, I think you can get a full set in Australia for about $500. So in the US, it'd be half that at like $250. And it's a great investment.
Yeah, Hex can be a great way of being able to weight bear in a
in a handstand.
neutral position.
Janelle's saying I spend about an hour a day on my wrists.
Probably too much.
You don't need to do that much.
Yeah.
That's 15 minutes a couple of times a week is more than enough. So let's just answer this one last question because we are out of time. Simon Vanderkratz is saying, I've had carpal tunnel surgery. I have lost some range of movement. Can I rehab the wrist to regain full range?
So you've already had the surgery. Great. Try it. You've just got to keep. You just got to keep trying to push that range a little bit more. Test it to the other side. Try and regain sort of as much as you can normal wise. But obviously post surgery, I'm not sure when you had your surgery, so follow your post-surgical guidelines first and foremost. But yeah, I think you should always be working back towards full range. Whether or not you particularly can, I can't say.
Remember that it's always load management is always going to be key, and progressive overload. It's not something you can fix overnight.
Just quickly on Janelle's, could the right tricep tightness, a tight tricep impact wrist range of motion? Not directly, like it won't be working on the actual wrist, but it might. I guess that puts you in more elbow extension, which it's not the issue. Don't be distracted by your triceps, work on your wrists. But
Yeah.
also don't work on your wrists too much. You've said you're working an hour a day, which is maybe too much.
Yeah, I'd say that's way
Because you think
too
about
much.
like how, with these structures, we need to give them stimulus and then we need to let them recover. And
Yep.
if your wrists are involved in lots of exercises throughout the week, so if you're already doing all the gym stuff with, like you're at home, but like we're using our wrists so much, and so we've got to respect the like necessary recovery time as well.
Yep. Awesome, team. Well, that's all we got
Sorry if
time
I
for today.
spoke really quickly. This might be, if you're on the podcast, re-listen at like 0.7 speed
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I'm a million miles an hour.
We had
But
a lot-
there's so much to talk about with this.
Yeah,
and so
we had a lot to
hopefully
get
it was,
going. Thanks
Yeah.
for everyone on the UMS Movement Mastermind Facebook group for your interaction. That was fantastic. It's good to see everyone
Yeah.
working so hard to
Yeah,
overcome.
and anyone who has picked up the handstand program over the weekend and are really excited about, getting stuck into doing handstands, just take this episode as a like good example
Embrace
of
the
why you
journey.
need to embrace the journey.
Yeah,
It's not a quick
don't
fix.
rush. Don't rush.
Is that still on
There's-
sale? Now
It is,
Yeah,
yep.
it
They've
is.
still got
It
another
is.
day and a half
Yeah.
to get it.
Yeah,
Yep.
Embrace the journey. That program is a fantastic program, and there is a lot of groundwork. It takes you through everything from the very beginning right through to being able to do a straight line handstand. So
Yeah.
embrace the journey, condition your core, condition your shoulders, condition your wrists, condition
Yeah.
your hands.
And thanks so much for Calais for the question, and that's been the grounds for what I think is hopefully a really useful episode here. So remember, everyone who is watching, we love your questions, and it really helps. It's like Calais' questions clearly helped a lot of people here. So make sure you do get your questions in, and we'll use it for another week.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
We'll see you all tomorrow. We've got a big series coming up. I won't give too much away just yet, but we'll see you tomorrow on the podcast.
See you later, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Yeah.
Health is about performance, not just body image.
You better be willing to accept what you're going to have to do to get there.
We'll start focusing on movement goals, strength goals, flexibility goals.
When you nail that skill, that's there forever.
The body image goal doesn't get you that
It's the
far.
consistency and frequency that's going to get you there. It's not the intensity.
There's no shortcuts to mastery and movement. Destination doesn't change overnight, but your direction will.
The gym is not the place to beat up the body that you hate. It's the place to build the body that you love.
We are the gym that teaches people how to move instead of just exercise, because we believe that health is about performance, not just body image.